Before we get into today's topic, as you might be able to tell, I am a little bit under the weather, but I really felt like recording this video. I was really in the mood to do it, and I also made the resolution for the next couple of weeks to record a lot more content because there was obviously a very long dry spell when it comes to videos, any kinds of videos, but especially these talks that I used to make in the beginning of the year, winter and spring. And I really want to get back on it. I have a lot more time now, and there are a lot of topics that I do want to talk about. So even though I'm a little bit, not really sick, but kind of, again, under the weather, I'm going to go ahead and record this. In the fitness industry, or more specifically in the YouTube fitness space, there is almost constant talk about strength training versus hypertrophy training. Of course, more generally, or actually rather more specifically, what people are referring to when they say these things, when they use these terms, is powerlifting and bodybuilding. And I actually made a video on the current bodybuilding scene, on bodybuilding in YouTube fitness, where I talked about functional training versus purely training for looks. And I talked about some of the things that bother me about modern day bodybuilding and the direction that the sort of science-based lifting, science-based bodybuilding, hypertrophy training is going in, which was generally speaking a very critical video. So one might think that in this question of strength training versus hypertrophy training, I'm on the side of strength here. Like, generally speaking, strength training is more functional and hypertrophy training is more, aesthetics focused. So I'm probably more of a proponent of strength training, which, by the way, just to be clear, I think thinking in absolutes as a Sith would, I think is generally a pretty stupid idea. But I'm more so using this topic as an accessible entry point to look at the concept of strength training, as you might be able to tell from the title, in general, in a more generalized context. Again, all that being said, generally speaking, one might think, okay, I'm probably more of a fan of strength training, of powerlifting, than I am of hypertrophy style training or hypertrophy focused training. And that is actually not the case, at all. In fact, I am much more fond of training focused on hypertrophy than I am of powerlifting. And there are some major reasons for that. But one of the first things I want to talk about is that I have a major problem with calling powerlifting strength training as opposed to bodybuilding style training, which can be, various different types of training. A sort of Arnold style workout is hypertrophy training, right? Is bodybuilding style training. But then the modern, a program with exercise selection, etc., designed by your modern day science-based lifter, that's also a hypertrophy focused, also a bodybuilding program. But generally speaking, I am very much opposed to calling these hypertrophy training if that is to be opposed to or set against strength training, which is supposedly powerlifting style training. And you might say, well, isn't that accurate? You know, powerlifters generally bench more, squat more, right? Like, they have bigger numbers. Their training is less balanced. They focus less on smaller muscles. But in the big three, they have bigger numbers than bodybuilders. Perhaps what is important to note is, generally speaking, for their body weight. Now, I would argue that probably on average, even if we adjust for body weight, powerlifters are perhaps a little bit stronger than bodybuilders. I have not looked at copious amounts of powerlifters' numbers specifically for this video and created like an average and then looked at bodybuilders and then adjusted for weight. But I'd say my general estimate is powerlifters are noticeably stronger compared to their body weight. I don't know how much stronger they actually are, just flat out. Like, if you take the average powerlifter and the average bodybuilder, and let's, okay, for the sake of the argument and for the sake of talking about decent people, assume that they are both not on any kind of performance-enhancing drug. Two natural people. I'm not actually sure how much stronger a powerlifter is compared to a bodybuilder. But we'll get into that. Probably still a little bit stronger on the big three. Maybe even noticeably. But we'll talk about that. Here's the thing, okay? Strength is not powerlifting. Powerlifting is a part of strength. Like, what you do in powerlifting is a strength-based activity. I am not debating that, and I think no one should debate that because that's pretty obvious. You are lifting heavy stuff. That's strength. That's a strength activity. So powerlifting is a form of strength. But strength is not powerlifting. Strength does not equal the sport of powerlifting, which has 3 very specific lifts. And I'm not necessarily, though I'm also going to talk about that, I'm not necessarily talking about smaller forms of strength here. You know, to being able to lift like this with your arm out, lift something heavy off to the side and over your head, stuff like that. Which is also strength, by the way, and which powerlifters are not going to be very good at. But even if we're talking about significant acts of strength, like moving a significant amount of weight, powerlifters are not necessarily good at that if it falls noticeably outside the domain that is the big three. I think to talk about strength, it is important to talk about what that actually is, what that means, before we can talk about which style of training is most favorable when it comes to building general strength, or, you know, the largest amount of strength. To talk about that, we actually have to know what exactly we want to define as strength. To do that, I have come up with the concept of the endurance power scale. And I'm going to maybe do a little bit more editing for this video than I usually do, which is virtually none, and insert this scale somewhere around here, the middle of the screen. Essentially, what the endurance power scale is a spectrum which reaches all the way from endurance, which is going to be on one of these sides, I don't know, to power. Endurance, of course, being the ability to just endure something, which does not really require a ton of strength. So I think the more we get into endurance, the further we get into endurance, we are talking about willpower and physical stamina. So when we reach the point on the scale, which is marked as endurance, we are no longer talking about something that involves any form of strength, really, physical strength. It's only willpower and stamina. Power is, I think, more closely related to strength, but it's also not specifically strength. It is a different concept. Power is a lot about technique. So power is generally how much force you can generate. If we are talking about a punch being powerful, exerting a lot of power, that doesn't necessarily have to mean that it was a strong punch, in the sense that there was a lot of strength involved. If a punch is very light but extremely fast, I would argue that it's not necessarily strength-based, but it's still a very powerful punch, potentially. If we're thinking in like an anime context, to get more visual with this idea, if you have a really, really big character who's like super jacked, he's going to throw a strong punch. If you have like the classic anime protagonist who's built like he's in 8th grade, but he's actually super powerful, he is probably not going to be super strong, although what am I talking about? It's an anime. He's probably also super strong, but let's assume he was actually as strong as his build suggested. Probably not super strong, but there's still probably, I assume, because he's the protagonist, a lot of power in his punches. Because he's punching incredibly fast. He's punching faster than the speed of sound or whatever, you know. You watch anime, I know you do. Don't lie to me. I don't actually know if this is an accurate representation. Doesn't matter. We're talking about a very big guy throwing a punch that isn't as fast, but it has a lot of strength behind it. It's a weighty punch, and he put some strength into it. And then we got a punch which is essentially thrown with perfect technique. There's not a lot of strength involved in accelerating the punch, and the punch is not very heavy, but it has an incredible amount of force because the technique is perfect. The movement of the joints, which generate the force of the punch, is perfect. I would say power still has a significant amount of strength involved. However, power to a great degree is about agility, some form of agility. So essentially about your ability to use the body you have in the most ideal way possible. Ironically, I would argue powerlifting is only to a very limited extent actual power lifting. I mean, yes, there is absolutely technique involved in powerlifting. That's actually, one of the main gripes people have with powerlifting is the potentially quite silly looking way in which the bench press, for instance, is done. But you are doing the movements in a very slow, very controlled manner. So I would argue that is actually very much strength focused. Whereas if it was only about power, if it was literal powerlifting, you would do it very explosively. Because that's the easiest way to generate the largest amount of power. Like the way powerlifters lift weight, competition style, is not the ideal way to generate the most power. It is an optimized way, if we're talking about the technique, of generating more strength than your muscles are actually able to generate, possibly. You know, if we're talking about the super high arch on the bench press, if you were bench pressing normally, you would not be able to bench press as much weight. But if you actually wanted to bench press as much weight as possible, you just be as explosive as possible. Like you go down quick, not super quick, not let the weight drop completely, right? You don't want to tear something. Although, depending on how you're built, that might be possible as well. And this is kind of the thing, right? Power can also be very individual and very much focused on how someone is built versus just how strength works, how muscles work. But you would lower it very quickly and then try to explode out of that press instead of doing a clean, controlled rep. Which I'm, by the way, not saying that's a good idea. I'm not saying that's they shouldn't do that the way they do it. I'm just saying it's funny that it's called powerlifting, in my opinion, where the reps are very clean and very controlled and comparatively slow compared to, you know, other styles. I'm thinking of like the CrossFit the fucking weird flipper dolphin pull-ups and shit like that right now. Anyways, side tangent. Let's get back to the topic at hand. I'm actually noticing that I'm only about 85% awake, but it's fine. We'll get through it. So we got endurance on one side and power on the other side. Why this scale? What's the point of this scale? The point of this scale is to demonstrate that strength is a spectrum. And strength exists within a range on this scale, on this, wherever it might be, endurance power scale. Because if you actually think about what the word strength means, if you actually think about how people use the word strength, and not just power lifters and bodybuilders, and not just people who work out in general, how people who actually speak English or another language, like people who actually talk to each other and actually think about other stuff than the gym and lifting weights. If you think about how people talk and how people use words, what is strength? What does the word strength actually mean? What does it refer to? And this is one of the big gripes I have with powerlifting and with calling powerlifting strength training, because it is not. Like, not at all. Not even remotely. Again, powerlifting is absolutely an aspect of strength. But calling powerlifting strength training, and especially if we're talking about powerlifting as opposed to, say, different types of bodybuilding style training, that's a doozy. That's a little bit wild, to be honest. If we look at strongman competitions, I think no one would argue that what those guys are doing is not strength. I think that's pretty obvious. And I'm not just saying that because the thing is called strongman, because again, a lot of people call powerlifting strength training. And more importantly, powerlifting is called powerlifting, even though arguably there's only a very limited amount of power involved, as opposed to just lifting based on strength and a little bit of leverage. So that's not the main reason I am saying strongman is strength-based activities. If you just watch a strongman competition, or multiple, because they have different lifts, right? They sort of rotate through different challenges, different types of lifts. But if you look at all of these challenges, they involve different muscle groups. They involve different parts of the body. They involve perhaps a different balance of strength endurance and like immediate strength, if you will, short-term strength. But all of it is strength, without a shadow of a doubt. And I actually mentioned a key word here: strength endurance. Strength endurance is kind of related to endurance, which is why we call it strength endurance, obviously. But it is very much still strength. And I think anyone who uses the English language, even if they don't lift, would consider holding an atlas stone on your shoulders, like holding it in the air, holding it up for an hour, strength. I'm thinking about, or I'm thinking of, rather, one of the challenges they had in the Physical 100 Season 1, which, by the way, is a really fun show. I can actually highly recommend that to people who are into sports and working out and generally interested in peak human condition. One of the challenges they had was competitors just standing there and holding an atlas stone for ages. I think they genuinely held it for like an hour. And it was not crazy heavy, but it was pretty heavy. Like it was over 50 kilograms, I think. And they were just standing there and holding this incredibly unwieldy object for ages, for tens of minutes. Yeah, you can say that, totally. That's strength. That's absolutely strength. Now, if we look at the power endurance scale, this is obviously further towards the side of endurance. And there is certainly stamina involved in these types of activities. But they are very much, in a major way, a strength activity. And again, I don't think anyone would really argue that, except perhaps people who are like in deep, who are really, really into lifting, where they use like very oddly specific definitions for words that really don't mean what they are saying they mean. Again, powerlifting is not strength training. Powerlifting is powerlifting, and powerlifting involves strength. Powerlifting is in a major way a strength activity. So it is certainly an aspect of strength, but strength does not equal powerlifting. A powerlifter would be terrible at holding an atlas stone up for 50 minutes, or an hour and 15 minutes, or however long. They would be the worst. Not the worst, they would probably do better than someone who has never trained, but you get what I'm saying. I'm exaggerating a little bit here. But powerlifters are mainly good at, well, powerlifting. And if we leave that very specific realm and we go into any sort of strength activity that does not exist within the realm of the big three, so that is significantly different in terms of the movement pattern and in terms of the muscle groups involved. And we also leave the realm of the 1 rep max, of 1 rep strength. Strength on a single repetition on an exercise, on a single, might I add, controlled, symmetric repetition, because all of these are compound exercises done with both hands in a very controlled manner, symmetrically, under perfect conditions. Does that equal strength? Again, I'm not saying powerlifting is not strength, but like, how great is a powerlifter going to be at just carrying heavy shit over his head? And I think it makes sense at this point to get into the part where we are going to compare the actual strength capabilities that are built by a proper bodybuilding training versus a powerlifting style training. Because the truth is, a bodybuilder ideally works out to build his muscle. It's literally called bodybuilding. He's building his body. So what a bodybuilder ideally is doing is strengthening all of the muscles in his body to a certain degree. And ideally, as much as possible, because he's trying to get as big as possible. Now, I wouldn't argue that's a good thing if you're on steroids, but for a natural bodybuilder, I would get as big as possible first, and then work on specifics, on specific balances, aesthetics, stuff like that. Now, obviously, that kind of thing isn't something I care about personally. I do try to balance out the size of my muscles, or how much volume I invest into them, rather, but that is focused mainly on strength, on the actual performance of my muscles. I don't really care about whether or not my physique is balanced, because the fact of the matter is, if you train in a way that strengthens all of your muscles, generally speaking, your physique will be balanced. And the reason why, for instance, powerlifters do not have a balanced physique, generally speaking, and those who kinda sorta do, are generally people who do accessory work on the side, which is essentially sort of a whack version of bodybuilding training at that point. The reason why this is because powerlifting training does not strengthen all the muscles in the body equally. And in fact, it has a major flaw, in my opinion, because it does not involve a proper pulling exercise. Some gym bros out there will actually recommend to gym beginners, to novices, to just start with the big three, to kind of get into training. And then they can graduate to more different types of exercises. This is a terrible suggestion. If you actually want to build a balanced body, and it doesn't even matter that much if you care about visuals, if you care about aesthetics, if you actually want to build a balanced body in terms of strength, why are 2 of the 3 exercises you're doing mainly for the lower body, and you don't have a single proper pulling exercise that is going to strengthen your lats? The 3 exercises, if we have to select 3, and I actually recently made a list of the 3 exercises I would recommend to beginners. Like, if I had to pick 3, the 5 exercises I would recommend to intermediates, and the 7 I would recommend to more advanced lifters, which, again, like, I would use more exercises than 3, 5, and 7 respectively, but if I had to limit myself, those would be like the core of working out for these categories. And if you're curious about that, if you're interested in that, I might actually go ahead and make a video about it in the future. But the 3 exercises I would recommend to a beginner are the bench press, the squat, and the pull-up. Obviously, with weight added as soon as you're able to do a couple. And the reason why is because the big three are not a balanced distribution of muscle training. The deadlift, by many considered to be a back exercise, does not train the upper back a ton, which is the biggest part of the back. You get, sure, some traps involvement, although limited to a degree because you're not actively moving the traps a ton. Not really. You're mainly pulling from your sort of hip area. That's like a very general explanation, but I'm not going to show a deadlift here. You know what a deadlift looks like. Most of the drive is coming from the legs. And then it's essentially a hinge, as you well know, right? Like, you are moving your hip, you are moving your legs, you are, of course, moving your spinal erectors, and there's a lot of pressure on the muscles surrounding the spine. So it's a great exercise for many different reasons. I'm not shitting on the deadlift in any way, shape, or form. But is the deadlift an excuse to not have any proper pulling exercise in your regimen? Hell no. The deadlift is a great exercise for many different reasons. Training your lats and even certain parts of your traps is certainly not one of them. I'm sorry. So recommending to beginners to do the big three and just get started with that and then transition into other lifts is shit advice. Because a lot of the muscles, a lot of the things I just mentioned are covered by the squat. Depending on how you do a squat, you got the glutes in there. Okay, so you got hip action involved. The hip is being hinged. There's hinging going on. Okay? You're also training the quads, which are not really getting work during a deadlift. I mean, they are being used, okay? But it's like the deadlift is mainly a hip hinge. You are already doing some hip hinge action on a squat. And if you're squatting heavy, your hips are getting enough work. They are fine. You also got your spinal erectors involved on the squat. Because actually, quite literally, most of your spine is below the bar. So if you're squatting heavy, your spine is, or rather the muscles surrounding your spine, are doing a shit ton of work. Because they are underneath the bar. The weight is literally, in the most simple physical sense possible, pushing on your spinal erectors. And they have to keep the spine straight, or have to keep the back from rounding out. And from you being pushed into one of those, if you remember them, those robots that you could fold into a ball underneath your squat bar. So a lot of the positive things the deadlift does, the squat already does. But then on top of that, you now have pull-ups, which do everything the deadlift does for the back better. Except, again, the spinal erector work, which you don't really need necessarily if you're doing squats. Because squats are great for the spinal erectors. I mean, for training them. The spinal erectors probably hate squats, but I mean, we're not asking them. We want them to get stronger, not to be happy. Where was I? I'm kind of trailing off here. What the fuck am I talking about? What I'm talking about is if we compare strength on anything that is not the big three, between a bodybuilder and a powerlifter, the bodybuilder is probably stronger. If we take two people who are both same weight, same height, same level of muscularity, same body fat percentage, and we put one on a powerlifting style training and we put one on a bodybuilding style training for, 3 years or something, like a significant amount of time. And just to be clear, we're not talking about a powerlifting style training which has a shit ton of actual hypertrophy training in there. We're talking about a proper, focused on maxing out your 1 rep strength type of powerlifting training. No weird mishmash, no power building workout plan. And I know a lot of powerlifters do some additional isolation work to strengthen the muscles that are actually involved in the big three. That is totally fine. If that is standard powerlifting procedure, that's going to be part of our example. After these 3 years, here's my estimation of where these guys' strength is at. The powerlifter is going to be stronger than the bodybuilder on the big three, if we're talking about a 1 rep max. I think that is pretty obvious. That's what he's been focusing on for 3 years. He's probably going to be stronger if we're talking about that. The powerlifter is probably also going to be stronger on doing the big three 4 reps if we're talking about a rep range of 8, 9, maybe a little bit above 10, anything up to maybe 15 reps. I would argue the powerlifter is probably going to be stronger. Doing the big three for high rep ranges, high, these are obviously heavy exercises, right? But if we're talking about doing them with a lighter weight for 30 reps, 40 reps, 50 reps, an absurdly high rep range, I don't actually know. I'm not that sure. Reason being that the bodybuilder is probably going to have better strength endurance, because the bodybuilder ideally trains both his fast twitch and his slow twitch muscle fibers to gain the largest amount of mass possible. So potentially he might compare more favorably to the powerlifter on the big three if we're talking about rep ranges that go more so into strength endurance than into immediate strength. I don't know if there's actually a term for it. If there is, it slipped my mind. But strength essentially based on fast twitch muscle fibers, the right now type of strength. Strength endurance wise, he might not do terribly compared to the powerlifter. But potentially the powerlifter is still stronger, is still going to edge out on those. I don't know though. He might not. They might be fairly equal. If we are talking about exercises that are variations of the standard big three, so squat variations, bench press variations, and deadlift variations, for 1 rep max and lower rep ranges, the powerlifter is probably still going to be stronger. However, less significantly so. On the 1 rep max, I'd argue he is probably noticeably stronger. If we're talking about 8 reps, 12 reps, something like that, I'd say it's a lot more equal. And potentially on some of these, they might be equal in strength, in performance. If we're going high rep ranges, again, I don't know. I think the bodybuilder might have the edge here. He might actually be starting to edge out on some of these, actually be stronger. But generally speaking, this is still slightly, or not slightly, like still noticeably in favor of the powerlifter, but not as significantly as the classic style big three. Now we get into exercises that are different movement patterns, okay, not a variation of the big three. The bodybuilder is going to be stronger on these. The powerlifter might compare to the bodybuilder on some of these, possibly. If they are exercises that are using some of the same muscle groups that the big three use, even though the movement pattern is different, maybe, they're going to compare, they're going to be okay, perhaps. But generally speaking, the bodybuilder is stronger on these. Now think about how many exercises, how many movements there are that are not a variation of the big three. Starting obviously with the big one, pull-ups, and really any kind of proper pulling exercise. Like a bodybuilder is going to be significantly stronger than a powerlifter on a bent over row. Even though the powerlifter has done all that spinal erector strengthening, which is not a bad thing for a bent over row, but you do have to actually be able to pull weight. There's also, lifting stuff over your head, doing things like any kind of overhead press variation. Not something a powerlifter is going to be great at if he only trains for the big three. And let's not talk about arm strength, okay? Let's not talk about curls. A powerlifter might do okay on any kind of triceps exercise, but he will do worse on it than a bodybuilder who's probably trained his triceps into oblivion. So on these types of exercises, the powerlifter is going to be worse. Okay. What about movements that are not actually an exercise that people do? What about wonky, sort of asymmetrical, atypical movements? Again, what I talked about at the beginning, this kind of stuff. Lifting things over your head, moving things with one hand over here. Who's going to be better at that? The bodybuilder. For the simple reason that the bodybuilder has specifically trained his arms and shoulders. The arms and shoulders are like the big weak part of powerlifting. Powerlifters, of course, train their front delts. They bench press constantly. But apart from that, their delts, and more importantly, their upper arms, are kind of shit because they don't specifically train them. And specifically training your arms, as anyone who does bodybuilding will know, is incredibly important for achieving the kind of arm size that many people consider to be aesthetic. More importantly than this being aesthetic is the fact that it is actually functional. There's a reason why big arms look good, and that is that arms, the upper arm, the lower arm, and the shoulder, which obviously is part of moving the arm around without moving the rest of the body, are involved in almost every single movement you can think of that is strength-based. On almost every movement that involves strength, the arms are doing something. They aren't always doing a ton. There are some movements where they're just holding something, they're just stabilizing. They're not actually pulling it. They're not actually the main muscle that is involved strength-wise. But your arms are involved in almost everything when it comes to strength. And powerlifters don't specifically train their arms. And this is a huge detriment to their strength. Never mind the fact that, they don't train a bunch of other stuff as well. But the arms, and specifically the upper arms and shoulders, because their lower arms might be okay depending on how they train, depending on how much rep work they do for deadlifts and stuff like that. Maybe their lower arms are fine, although specifically working out the lower arms, also great, also important in my opinion. But specifically the upper arms and the shoulders are going to be pretty ass. We all know the spider physique, right? We all know the typical, what I like to call the tower look, where powerlifters are packed with muscle in the sort of center, but that's it. Like they're just kind of long and deep. Like they have chest, they have some traps, especially the upper traps, right, from deadlifting. So they got all of their muscle essentially packed into this tower, but there's nothing going out to the side. Like they have no noticeable arms. The front delts are the muscular part of the shoulder, which is also sort of on the body. The side delts, not really noticeable. No arms, no side delts, no significant lats. So instead of having a sort of tapered physique that goes up, that is, a little wider at the hips, and then it gets slimmer at the waist, and then it really tapers out towards the shoulders, they have this kind of tower look, which is essentially just a dude who looks kind of strong, but also weirdly not, because it's a very specific physique, I feel like. You can look at a lot of people and kind of tell that they are powerlifters, like if they're actually dedicated. And again, I don't care about aesthetics as much as I care about the fact that training for an aesthetic body, if you're not just focusing on aesthetics, but if you're focusing on balance, more importantly, right? And you're training for different types of strength, you're training for different types of functionality, but you are training, importantly, in a way that trains, ideally, all of the muscles in your body, and it trains them in a way that is going to keep them balanced. I kind of lost where that fucking sentence was going because it was, it became way too long. Anyways, you get what I'm saying. The point is, training for aesthetics, if you're not just focused on the looks, but you're focused on the balance, is automatically going to create a physique that is much more functional in terms of the actual strength than a powerlifter's. And you might say, well, a powerlifter has all of these neurological adaptations to lifting heavy weight on the big three. And to that I would say, sure, but who has more muscle mass? The bodybuilder, obviously. Okay, what takes longer? Building considerable size as a natural lifter, but even if you were enhanced, which I'm not going to talk about, but even if you were enhanced, like your limit has just risen up. You can just go to a more significant size. Building significant muscle mass, does that take longer? Or does it take longer to adapt your nervous system to heavy weights? And you can figure that one out on your own, but I think we all know the answer. Considering this fact, it does not make sense, in my opinion, to focus on training the nervous system for big lifts, as opposed to building a bunch of muscle mass, which literally exists to make the body stronger in general, not adapted to a specific movement, but just in general. Muscle mass just makes the muscle stronger for any movement that the muscle is involved in, right? How does it make more sense to focus on neural adaptation as opposed to focusing on building a shit ton of muscle, and also in the process of doing that, lifting heavy and doing a 1-rep max every once in a while to, adapt your nervous system over a longer period of time, more slowly, keep it adapted to heavy weights, but not focus on that all the time. Instead, focus on building muscle. And here lies a big problem that I have with powerlifting in general, which is weight classes. If powerlifting is about lifting the largest amount of weight, how are there weight classes? How does that make any sense at all? Because this would technically mean that if I get heavier, I might get worse at powerlifting. It's probably not going to be the case. I think in most cases with people getting significantly bigger, the strength gains might, I suppose, outweigh the negative of entering a new weight class. But how is that even a possibility? Me getting bigger equals me getting worse at powerlifting, which is about 1-rep maxes? Huh? What actual strength training looks like is incorporating all of the different things that I mentioned throughout this video. Strongman style activities, strongman style training, strongman style attributes need to be strengthened. Bodybuilding style training, classic hypertrophy work, working out to build a shit ton of muscle mass, because muscle mass, foundational muscle tissue, is going to make you stronger at everything that involves those muscles. And if you strengthen every muscle because you're looking to look good, you're going to get stronger at everything. And from there, it's a very small step to also be very strong at the big three. So all of these things are things you should work on. But you should not be training the big three. You should be training bench press and squats and deadlifts, just as you train pull-ups and bent over rows and curls and triceps extensions and all of that good shit. Good mornings, whatever the fuck, calf raises, wrist curls. Do it all. That is actual strength training. Do the strongman shit. Walk up a fucking hill, as I did, video somewhere up here, with a heavy ass backpack 20 times. Because why the fuck not? That is strength as well. Do it all, and you can call yourself a strength athlete. You can call yourself someone who does strength training. Calling powerlifting style training strength training, as opposed to bodybuilding, which is hypertrophy training, is a joke. Because as I mentioned, on most things that are not very closely related to or actually are the big three, powerlifters are weaker than people who train for hypertrophy. So, what the fuck are we talking about here? Powerlifting is not strength training. Powerlifting is an aspect of strength. Again, powerlifting involves strength, mainly. It is almost entirely strength. But powerlifting does not equal strength. Strength is a very big field. It encompasses a lot of different aspects. And if you actually want to be an impressive strength athlete, you should train for all of these aspects to an extent. And if you aren't, go ahead and call yourself a powerlifter or a strongman or a bodybuilder, but don't go around referring to yourself as someone who does strength training when you're literally training for the highest number on a single rep on 3 different exercises. That is fucking silly. All that being said, I might have to do quite a bit of editing on this video because I got very rambly sort of around the middle to later third part half of the video. How is there a later third half? That's actually an interesting concept I just put forward there, and it might be even more bizarre than calling powerlifting strength training. All right, if you enjoyed the video, if you found this interesting, if you like me hitting the mic accidentally as I just did, if you learned something, go ahead and leave a like. If you want to follow me on my journey of growing this channel, or if you're just interested in seeing more of these videos in the future, don't want to miss anything, go ahead and subscribe and activate the notification bell if you do, because why not? Or don't, I suppose. If you don't want notifications, I don't really care. Either way, if you have any questions, if there's anything you want to know, if you have any remarks, anything you want to talk about regarding this video, or you have any suggestions, any questions that you would like to see answered in a future video, anything you would like me to talk about, go ahead and leave a comment. Shit, my voice is actually kind of leaving me here, which is not ideal because I'm, again, heading out in like 10 minutes. Shit, this video has gotten longer than I expected. Regardless, that's going to be it for today. I'm going to see you guys in another video very soon, probably this week, maybe even, perhaps. We'll see. Until then, adios.